So I have my dye that I have filtered through a coffee filter to get rid of as much of the extra plant material as I can. And now I'm going to take this dye and make something called a lake pigment, which is what these are. So there are a number of reasons why I want to use an insoluble pigment like a lake pigment to make paint with. One of the main reasons when you're dealing with botanical dyes has to do with light fastness. For example, this is an ink that I made from a similar plant dye, and an ink is just a very concentrated dye solution. I can put this in a pen and draw with this. And this is a lake pigment that I made from a similar plant dye. And when I draw with these on the same paper and put them in a sunny window, this ink will fade much faster than the paint that I make with the lake pigment. Now we're going to make our lake pigment. This is a chemical reaction, but I'm going to make this very basic. We are going to start with a compound called alum. Alum comes in several forms. This one you can find in the spice aisle. People use it for pickling. And potash alum, which has some potassium in it, is what a lot of people use for dyeing. But the important ingredient in this lake pigment is the aluminum sulfate. So I tend to buy this one that's 100% aluminum sulfate. Now, alum likes to grab a hold of color. So when we put the alum in here, it's going to grab a hold of the yellow and hang on to it so that when we go and put our second compounds in, they will form a precipitate. And we're going to use two different ones. The first one I have done is something called washing soda. And you can find this in your grocery store aisle. You just need to make sure it says sodium carbonate because that's what you want. The second one is calcium carbonate, which is basically ground limestone or chalk. This one happens to be food grade. Both of these, when mixed in solution with alum, will form a precipitate, and that precipitate that settles out will have the yellow color, like these. All right, the first thing I'm going to do is dissolve these in some hot water. Well, and actually the calcium carbonate won't dissolve. We'll talk more about that later. Both the washing soda and the alum will dissolve. And the alum I'm going to split between the two of these, so I need to make sure I can actually see what I'm doing here. All right, now I'm going to have to stir them up to get them to completely dissolve. You can dump them in as solids, but I just find the reaction goes a little bit better if you've got them in solution. So I'm going to get these all dissolved and then I'll be back. Okay, so I've got these in water. You can see the alum and the washing soda, both soluble in water, so they have dissolved. Calcium carbonate is not soluble in water, so it has just suspended. One of the things you want to do once you've made your pigment is to rinse it, because you want to rinse the extra stuff away, and that works really well when you've got things that are extra that are soluble in water, because they will rinse out. If you've added way too much chalk to your lake pigment, you aren't going to be able to get rid of this, which means you're going to end up with a lighter pigment. So there are ways to figure out exactly how much of each thing you need to add to make the most of precipitate. Basically what I do is I add by volume twice as much alum as I add of either the washing soda or the calcium carbonate. Okay, so I'm going to start with the alum. Let's move this a little closer. I'm going to try to add half of this. You're going to see it's going to turn a little brighter, hopefully, as I do this. Let's see. Or change it. It's going to be more intense. A little more. Okay. And then we'll add the rest of it to this one. you can see that this has actually become a much more intense yellow color with the addition of the alum. Now we're going to add our washing soda. Now I've got this on a tray because depending on how hot your stuff is and how small your jars are, this actually, one of the byproducts of this is carbon dioxide. So it will fizz, and it is quite possible that it will fizz over. Oh, it's not going to do it. That's good. All right, that was the washing soda. Now this is the calcium carbonate, which I need to stir up again. There's that. Sometimes when you do this, if you're too full, you'll get foamy stuff all out. So you want to make sure you've got something for it to go in. All right, so we will let these settle, and then I will be back. Okay, just one more thing. You see the foam? It's really pretty. So to get that foam, which has quite a bit of pigment in it, to settle down into the liquid, I just spray it with distilled water. And then let me show you where we are. It's probably been a half an hour. And this was the calcium carbonate precipitate, and it is settled quite a bit. The alum and sodium carbonate is probably going to take overnight. So I will see you tomorrow. Okay, so it's the next day. You can see that the calcium carbonate lake has settled all the way down here. The sodium carbonate lake has only settled to about here. You also notice they are different colors. Remember, this is the same dye that I laked with two different precipitators. My guess is that there's a difference in pH between these two solutions, and I just happen to have some pH paper, so I thought I'd check it out. So this is what the pH paper looks like. I'm just gonna put some in the liquid here. I'm gonna let it sit for a second. Now I'm gonna do the sodium carbonate. Oh yeah, look at that. So here's the little, so this is definitely very much more on the basic side as opposed to being on the acidic side here. And this one on the right looks like it's almost a neutral pH. So that's pretty cool. But as any of the dyers know, you can change the color of your dye solution a little sometimes if you change the pH of the liquid. All right, so now what I have to do is get the water off of both of these and then rinse the pigment. And so this one I'm going to be able to decant the water off a little bit and then pour it through a funnel. And this one I'm just going to pour through the funnel because I don't want to lose any of my pigment. So I will be back. These two lake pigments have been draining overnight. I have been, as they drain down, filling them back up with water to rinse the pigment. And now what I need to do is dry them. So the lake pigments I just put them on a rack. The lake pigments take quite a while to dry, usually a couple of days. You can see they're nicely pigmented, highly pigmented, which is what I like in my watercolors. Well, in any of my pigments. They're more useful to make paint with. when they have a lot of color in them. This is the one that was made, move this out of the way, with the calcium carbonate. That's going to be a great color. So we will just wait for those to dry, and then I will grind them up and I will show you what I do with them. They are almost dry. The calcium carbonate lake dries a little bit faster than the sodium carbonate one does. They both are going to be really nice, intense yellows. This is the calcium carbonate lake, which is going to have some opacity to it because of the chalk. That's also why you can see the yellow color. This is a sodium carbonate lake, which looks just black, but that's okay. That just means it's got a lot of pigment in it, and it's going to make a very intensely colored paint. You can see it as this is the sodium carbonate paint as I'm mulling it up. And so I'm going to be able to get a wide range of, it's called chroma or intensity, from a pale yellow all the way to very dark with this paint, which makes, and this is how I like my lake pigments to look. I like them to be highly pigmented. They make a much more useful paint that way. All right, so I've got this mulled up. I'm just going to swatch it. And here's the calcium carbonate lake pigment, which we will swatch up below. So now I've made watercolors from the 2 lake pigments that I made. But another thing I like to do using the lake pigments that I make with calcium carbonate is to use them to make the pastel pigment sticks. I make my pigment sticks using natural clay as a binder. In this case, I've taken my lake pigments and I've used a kaolin clay that I purchased for a couple of them. And then I've also used a white clay that I've foraged. I don't use any other types of binders in these sticks. The clay holds them together fine. You just mix it with water and form it into a stick and let it dry. With this one, I used a Marigold Lake pigment that I made a couple of years ago, and I mixed it with the kaolin clay, and it is quite a good consistency, like a soft pastel, good color. This was made with a cochineal lake that I actually used ground eggshells in, which are calcium carbonate. And I mixed that also with the kaolin clay. And again, a very nice soft pastel-like stick. And then this rabbit brush lake I mixed with my foraged white clay, which is a little bit softer. It doesn't hold together quite as well as the kaolin does, and it makes a really good color, but it is a little soft, and if I push too hard it falls apart. So this one actually I should try again with the kaolin clay to make a slightly more usable stick, but all of these are really good colors. Though I tend to not make a lot of pigment sticks using my lake pigment colors, and mostly that is due to light fastness issues, and I'm going to talk about that in the next clip. One of the most important things we need to talk about if you are using plant dyes or the cochineal bug dye to make your paints or pigments is that none of these pigments, none of these colors are stable, and they will all fade in UV light, and a lot of them will also change color either due to oxidation or possibly the pH of the paper. I will show you a few examples of that. This is an ink I made from the Catoni Aster Berry, which is purple, and it has been closed up in this journal, and it has lasted pretty well. I also made a lake pigment from that, and probably due, oops, sorry, wrong paper. Probably due to the acidity or something in the medium, that lake pigment, it went on purple and looked like that for a while, but over, well, it's been 2018, it has turned gray compared to the ink, which is still a little bit purple. Here is a rabbit brush ink that I made, and here is the rabbit brush lake pigment that I made, and those have stayed pretty well in this journal, but here you can see that's the rabbit brush paint lake pigment that I made into paint, and in fact, here is the rabbit brush ink. These have been in a sunny window since 2018. Remember back earlier in this video how I told you that the lake pigment made from the dye would fade more slowly than the ink made from the dye? There is what's happened there. That ink is almost completely gone. This is that purple cotoneaster berry ink and lake pigment, and they have really changed. Here is, these are all lake pigments that I made into watercolors. Here is the rabbit brush lake, and this has probably been in the window since 2019 or so. This is a indigo maple pod. Lake maple pods have tannin in them, so they last a little bit longer. This is a coreopsis flower, which is gone. This is that cotoneaster lake, and then this is the cochineal. And cochineal is a good pigment, but it does fade. It's not light fast. It just fades a lot more slowly. Here is that, this is actually that rabbit brush lake. I made a lake pigment from the sodium carbonate and a lake pigment from the calcium carbonate, which is what this is. It's what we made those pastels out of. And here, this has only been in the window since 2022, and you can see, whoops, you can see that the sodium carbonate has faded, and the calcium carbonate has also faded, and it has oxidized. It's a little hard to see in this. It's better in real life, but it has changed. It has turned much browner. So that is, you know, there are a lot of people who make these. There are people who say that sell the paints or sell the pigments. I mean, it's a really cool thing to do, but there is a reason that we have synthetic pigments that are light fast, because these will not last. And when you're selling your art to people, I mean, it's one thing if you're just leaving it in a journal for yourself, that's great. But if you're selling art to people, you know, it really isn't fair to sell them something that you've done that is gonna fade or change over time. So hope you've enjoyed this video, and thank you for joining me.